Mason Carter was 10 years old the last time anyone saw him. It was a Saturday morning in early June, the kind of morning where the northern Minnesota air still held on to spring's last chill, but the sky had already started hinting at summer. Mason had arrived the night before with his mother at his Uncle Ray's cabin near Rock Hollow Lake, a remote patch of water surrounded by thick pine forest and old logging roads. His mother had packed his duffel neatly, 2 changes of clothes, granola bars, bug spray, and a fresh journal with a pen tucked into the spine. But Mason was focused on just one thing that weekend, his brand new GoPro. It was his 10th birthday gift, something he had asked for over and over, wanting to be like the kids he watched online who filmed their fishing trips and uploaded them with music in slow motion. His GoPro came with a small chest harness and waterproof case. That morning, he clipped it on himself, carefully aligning the lens in the mirror before zipping up his vest. He was quiet, the way most people described him, a thoughtful kid, observant, soft-spoken. But that morning, his eyes were bright. He was excited. They left around 6:10 a.m., Mason, his Uncle Ray, and his cousin Jonah, who was 13, and in that restless, slouching phase of adolescence where he was too cool for most things, but still willing to hang out when it meant avoiding chores. Ray drove them in his dusty red pickup along a gravel road that wound deeper into the woods until it ended at the edge of Rock Hollow Lake. The lake wasn't large, maybe a mile across, narrow in some places, bordered by rocky shoreline and reeds. The Carters had been coming there for generations, mostly for hunting, sometimes for fishing. It was a place that rarely changed. That's part of why Ray liked it. It felt dependable. They launched the small aluminium fishing boat without issue, gliding slowly across the still surface to the north side of the lake, where a half-rotted dock stretched out into a quiet cove. According to Ray's later statements, they'd chosen that spot because it was always good for panfish, bluegill, sunfish, and perch. Nothing big, but good for kids. They tied off the boat and set up along the dock. Mason rigged his line with help, baited his hook with a wiggling nightcrawler, then pressed record on his GoPro. The camera's tiny red light blinked against his chest. He looked up once at his uncle, grinning, and cast his line. There were no other boats on the lake. No one else was at the public access point. The cabin itself sat on the opposite shore, out of sight. Ray later said they heard loons, saw a deer pass near the trees, and watched Mason reel in a small perch just after 7 a.m. He filmed the whole thing, cheering softly and holding it up for the camera. The morning was calm. No wind, no current, no noise. What happened next has never been fully understood. Around 9 a.m., Ray left the dock to check a trail that ran up through the pines, maybe 40 yards from where the boys were. Jonah, bored with fishing, wandered a bit down the shoreline, skipping stones. Mason stayed by his pole, still filming, still watching the water. Ray says he was gone for no more than 10 minutes. Jonah says the same. When Ray returned, Mason was gone. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Maybe he had wandered up into the trees to find his uncle. Maybe he was collecting rocks or frogs. But after 2 minutes of calling his name, then 5, then 10, panic crept in. His pole still rested against the dock, the line drifting gently in the water. His tackle box sat closed, unopened since they arrived. His boots, the small waterproof pair he'd gotten for this trip, were neatly placed on the dock. But Mason was gone. Ray called out again, louder. Jonah joined in. There was no answer, no movement in the woods, no splash, no cries, nothing. The boat was still tied, undisturbed. The water was clear. At 9:17 a.m., Ray used his satellite phone to call the county sheriff's office. Within an hour, deputies arrived. By noon, K-9 teams were combing the trails. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats from search and rescue began dragging the lake with sonar. But nothing turned up. There were no child-sized footprints on the muddy trails. The dogs picked up no scent. Divers found nothing near the dock nor in the deeper pockets farther out. The GoPro, bright red case, chest-mounted, was gone. The life jacket Mason had been wearing? Gone. No scraps, no clothing, no torn fabric. His mother, who was called just before noon, arrived by early evening and stood at the shoreline for hours, refusing to sit, refusing to eat, just scanning the trees. By day 2, people began whispering theories. Maybe an animal dragged him off, maybe someone took him, maybe he drowned, and his body slipped into one of the lake's hidden sinkholes, narrow vertical cracks in the bedrock where water ran so deep no equipment could reach. But there was no evidence for any of it. No blood, no drag marks, no items washed ashore. Every explanation felt like reaching in the dark. By the end of the 3rd day, the sheriff's office issued an official statement: presumed accidental drowning, body unrecovered. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't active either. Not anymore. And Mason's mother, standing alone near the dock where her son had last stood, asked the only question no one could answer. If he drowned, where is he? The moment Ray Carter stepped back onto the dock and realized Mason wasn't there, something in his chest locked up. It had only been a few minutes, 10 at most. He'd followed a narrow trail that looped around the cove's edge, hoping to scout out a better spot to cast from. He'd called out once or twice, but there was no answer, which he hadn't thought much of at the time. It was a quiet lake, the sort of place where kids could roam without worry. When he returned, he expected to see Mason standing in the same place, maybe adjusting his GoPro or tangled in a line. But instead, the dock was empty. The rod was still resting where Mason had propped it, the line arcing gently into the shallows. The tackle box was untouched, bone dry, sitting precisely where the boy had placed it. His boots were still beside it, both standing upright clean, facing the water. But Mason was gone. No sound, no splash, no sign of distress. At first, Ray assumed Mason had wandered into the brush to follow him, but the path was undisturbed. Jonah was farther down the shoreline, skipping stones across a set of flat rocks, and hadn't seen or heard anything. Within 2 minutes, Ray was yelling the boy's name, walking in frantic circles up and down the edge of the lake, scanning the trees and water, his voice rising with every call. Jonah followed suit, but there was no response. Nothing stirred in the woods. The water remained still, unmoving. No bubbles, no floating objects, no ripples. Just silence. By 9:17 a.m., Ray made the call to 911, and within 45 minutes, local deputies arrived at the scene. By 11 a.m., the situation had escalated to a full-scale search. They began with the obvious. Deputies searched the boat, the dock, the tree line, and the trail Ray had taken earlier. Divers were called in by noon. The sheriff's office dispatched 2 search and rescue boats equipped with side-scan sonar. By 1 p.m., a helicopter circled overhead, scanning the lake for heat signatures or anything that might break the mirrored surface of the water. Canine units arrived by 2:30 p.m. and were walked up and down the shore, across the trail, and into the dense woods that bordered the lake's western edge. But the dogs couldn't pick up a trail. There was no scent path leading away from the dock. It was as if Mason had vanished mid-step. Searchers expanded the radius. They combed the woods in grid formation, marked trees with caution tape, and flagged possible trail intersections. But every sweep came back empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no discarded clothing, no torn life vest or gear. His GoPro was missing, but the harness had not been found either. The lake bottom was scanned multiple times. If he had slipped and fallen in, the equipment should have picked something up, but nothing appeared. Divers found no evidence of impact, no disturbance in the sediment, and Mason's vest had a bright reflective strip designed to surface under certain conditions. It never did. By evening, the Department of Natural Resources joined in, sending 2 officers with advanced sonar gear. The lake wasn't particularly large, but parts of it were surprisingly deep, carved from old glacial erosion. Some believed sinkholes were possible, though unconfirmed. Still, every logical explanation felt increasingly unlikely. Animal attack was considered, but wildlife experts ruled it out quickly. There were no drag marks, no blood, and the lake region had no recent sightings of large predators. More than that, no animal would have taken a child so cleanly, without a sound or struggle. Deputies interviewed Ray and Jonah separately. Their stories matched. Ray admitted he shouldn't have stepped away, but insisted he was only gone for minutes. Jonah, visibly shaken, said he looked over a few times and thought Mason was still at the dock. He never saw anyone else. No strangers, no boats, no sound. The sheriff's office ran checks on known offenders in the area, but there were no registered predators within a 20-mile radius. No cars had entered the old road that morning apart from Ray's truck. Wildlife cameras at the trailhead were checked but showed nothing unusual. By day's end, 24 hours after Mason disappeared, the only object recovered was his tackle box. It hadn't moved. It hadn't even been splashed. The lid was closed, the contents organized. It looked like a child had placed it down neatly, planning to come back. But he hadn't. As darkness fell, crews brought in portable lights and generator-powered spotlights to continue searching. Mason's mother arrived just after sundown. She stood on the shoreline, staring at the small aluminum boat bobbing gently in place, rope still tied to the dock, as if waiting for its owner to return. When she saw his boots, small, upright, still clean, she collapsed. Search teams worked into the night, some walking with poles through reeds and muddy patches, others on boats circling over and over, unwilling to accept the void. But there was no sign of him, no hair caught on a branch, no trail, no broken vegetation. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed a boy whole, without so much as a mark to show for it. In the weeks following Mason Carter's disappearance, the investigation shifted from urgent rescue to methodical elimination. Every possibility, no matter how improbable, was placed under the microscope. Abduction, animal attack, drowning. Each theory was dissected, mapped, and reenacted. And yet, none of them could explain the central facts. No blood, no broken branches, no footprints, and no scent trail. The first scenario the sheriff's office considered was abduction. A stranger slipping into the woods, grabbing Mason silently, and vanishing just as fast. But the logistics didn't make sense. Rock Hollow wasn't a tourist lake. The only road in and out was narrow, unpaved, and monitored by a wildlife trail camera installed by the Department of Natural Resources. Footage from that morning showed only one vehicle entering before 10 a.m., Ray Carter's pickup. No other car, truck, or ATV was recorded. There were no tire tracks near the lake, no unfamiliar boot prints in the surrounding mud. Deputies canvassed the area anyway. They knocked on cabin doors, some shuttered for the season, others occupied by weekend hunters. No one reported anything unusual. No parked vehicles, no strange sounds, no signs of people near the north side of the lake. It wasn't a spot you stumbled across. It was a place you had to know. Wildlife experts were brought in next to consider the possibility of a sudden animal attack. Northern Minnesota had black bears, coyotes, and the occasional cougar sighting. But none of them fit the pattern here. Bear attacks typically left trails, scuffle marks, broken branches, fur, even blood. Same with cougars. Coyotes were known to prey on smaller animals, not children standing on open docks. What disturbed officials most was how untouched everything looked. The rod was still upright, the tackle box was clean. The boots, dry side by side, suggested Mason had removed them himself, or they'd been arranged post-disappearance, which didn't match any known animal behavior. Game wardens checked trail cams in the broader county region. Nothing came back showing predator movement in the immediate area. Even tracks, paw prints, scratch marks, and scat were absent. There was no physical sign of an animal being there at all. The idea was officially ruled out within 5 days. That left the theory most investigators leaned toward: accidental drowning. Mason was a child. He may have leaned over, lost balance, hit his head, and slipped into the water before anyone noticed. The problem with that theory wasn't that it was implausible. It was that it had already been tested, exhaustively. Dive teams had gone down within hours. Side-scan sonar had been deployed. Cadaver dogs had sniffed every inch of the shoreline and even been placed on small boats to detect human remains below the surface. Nothing. And more than that, no disturbance in the silt, no trace of the GoPro, no fabric, no shoes. In drowning cases, even in deep water, evidence usually floats or washes ashore within 48 to 72 hours. Mason was wearing a vest with a foam lining. Something should have surfaced. It never did. By week 3, state-level investigators started questioning the terrain itself. Geologists and hydrologists were consulted to explore the idea that Mason had slipped into something below the lake bed, an underwater cave or fissure. The locals called them sinkholes, though technically they were submerged crevices formed by glacial melt and tectonic shifts long ago. Most were narrow, too tight for even a child to fall through. But a few, according to decades-old geological maps, had never been fully charted. The sonar picked up strange shadows in some areas, including a spot near the dock where Mason had last stood. A diver named Anthony Reyes attempted to reach that crevice during one of the later dives. He described a narrow rock wall that descended almost vertically. He went down as far as he could before the space pinched off completely. No remains were found, no clothing, no gear, just water and stone. Rumors began to stir. A retired sheriff from the next county over mentioned a case from the late 80s, another boy, 12, who disappeared while hiking near that same region. His body was never found either. Locals brought up older legends. Stories passed through families about hunters who vanished and about fishers who left their gear behind but never returned. None of it was official. None of it made it into the incident reports. But the whispers grew louder. The lake, some said, didn't just take things. It kept them. One woman told a deputy she remembered a teenage girl who'd vanished in the 70s. She was never listed in any missing person registry, but her name was scrawled in the back of an old yearbook kept at the county library. The deeper the investigators looked, the more strange patterns emerged. Always boys, always near water, always in quiet wooded places where there were no cameras, no cell service, and no witnesses. Mason's mother refused to accept the drowning theory. She visited the lake every day for 2 months straight, bringing a camp chair and sitting by the dock in silence. She asked the same question over and over to anyone who would listen. If he drowned, why didn't anything float back? She clung to the idea that something was missing, some piece of the puzzle they hadn't uncovered. Her son, she said, wouldn't have walked off. He wouldn't have gone into the water alone. Someone, or something, was involved. But what? Investigators had nothing left to test. The reports grew thinner. The updates stopped coming. Mason Carter, 10 years old, recorded his last moments on a camera that no one could find. And as summer faded into fall, his name became another file stored on a shared server marked pending reclassification, still active, but drifting further from resolution. In the weeks that followed Mason's disappearance, grief didn't bring the Carters together. It tore them apart. What started as whispered tension around kitchen tables quickly escalated into full-blown arguments behind closed doors. Mason's mother, Erin, couldn't accept the official narrative. Every night she sat with her sister on the back porch of the borrowed cabin, shaking her head, repeating the same quiet insistence. Someone took him, or it wasn't denial. It was conviction. She had seen her son hours before he vanished. He had been calm, content, tethered to the world by routine and rhythm. He wouldn't have wandered. He wouldn't have gone in the water alone. The lake was freezing that morning. He was cautious by nature. Something happened, and it wasn't an accident. But as the investigation stalled and leads dried up, the sheriff's department began adjusting its language. Search turned to recovery. Recovery turned to closure, and closure became a word that Erin refused to hear. Ray Carter, Mason's uncle and the last adult to see him alive, went from being her brother to the focus of her rage. At first, the family had tried to protect him. He was cooperative with law enforcement. He submitted to interviews and even allowed his phone and truck to be searched. But as pressure built and answers never came, Erin began asking why Ray had left Mason alone, even for a few minutes. Why had he wandered off at all if he was responsible for both boys? Why hadn't he kept a line of sight? The community began asking those questions too. Online threads emerged, first on regional Facebook groups, then on true crime forums. Posts dissected every piece of public information, the timing, the geography, the gaps in the timeline. When local news reported that Ray had agreed to a polygraph and failed it, the story exploded. The test was not admissible in court, but in the court of public opinion, it was enough to cast a long shadow. Ray insisted the questions were ambiguous, that he'd been exhausted, anxious, and under pressure. But the damage was done. Neighbors looked at him differently. Stores that once gave him a friendly nod now offered short glances in silence. Jonah, Mason's cousin, didn't say much. He was 13, reserved, and already retreating into the fog of adolescence. But after the first week, he stopped speaking about the trip entirely. His father tried to coax him into therapy. He refused. Then, late one night, Erin overheard him crying through the wall. She pressed her ear to the door. He was whispering. She couldn't hear all of it, but one phrase was repeated over and over. There was someone in the water. When she asked him the next morning, he denied it. He said he was dreaming. He said he didn't remember. But he didn't sleep in his room after that. He moved into the living room and kept the lights on. Every night. The case didn't officially go cold. It faded. Search teams were reassigned. The sheriff's office stopped issuing weekly updates. Volunteers stopped coming by the lake. The posters began peeling. Tips slowed to a trickle, and the emotional math of grief began to calcify into something harder. Erin refused to leave. She extended her rental month after month, spending afternoons walking the shoreline and mornings calling out into the trees. She created a website, posted updates, and contacted independent divers and sonar specialists across the Midwest. A few came. Most found nothing. One offered to bring cadaver dogs from out of state, but local authorities declined to cooperate, citing jurisdictional red tape. Erin accused them of giving up. They said they were doing their best. The truth sat somewhere between silence and inertia. Meanwhile, Ray stopped speaking to reporters. He withdrew from the community. Family dinners ended. Holidays passed without invitations. The wider Carter family fractured along invisible lines, those who believed it was an accident and those who believed something was being hidden. Rumors spread. Some speculated that Ray had a temper. Others claimed to have seen strange behavior from Jonah in the weeks leading up to the trip. None of it was substantiated, but the absence of evidence created a vacuum where speculation thrived. In a desperate attempt to move the investigation forward, Erin offered a $25,000 reward for any information about Mason's disappearance. A few tips came in, one claiming Mason had been seen with a man at a gas station 2 towns over, another suggesting someone had heard a child crying near a hunting shack deep in the forest. None held up. No surveillance footage, no new evidence, no prints, fibers, or witnesses. The boy had vanished, and with him, the family's ability to function as a unit. Even Jonah began to change. He withdrew further. His grades collapsed. He began drawing dark figures in the margins of his notebooks, long silhouettes half submerged in water. One of his teachers flagged the drawings and contacted a school counselor. When asked what they were, he replied, "It's the man from the lake." When pressed, he shut down completely. By the end of the year, no arrests had been made, no new evidence had surfaced. The GoPro remained missing. Mason's name was listed on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database, but his photo began to blend into the growing wall of faces. Erin stayed in town, refusing to leave Rock Hollow, convinced that if she did, Mason would never be found. Ray sold the cabin. He left quietly, without notice, and moved 3 counties away. Jonah changed schools. Therapy was recommended again. The nightmares continued. Every so often, late at night, he still whispered about the figure standing in the lake, watching, unmoving, just below the surface. 3 years after Mason Carter vanished from Rock Hollow Lake, the world had moved on. His name no longer appeared in local headlines. The sheriff who led the original search had retired. The active investigation had been formally reclassified as inactive, pending new evidence. For most, it became a sad story folded into local lore, spoken about in fragments. But for Erin, Mason's mother, time hadn't moved forward at all. Every morning she still checked her email for new tips, watched weathered trail cam footage from volunteers, and posted weekly on a subreddit she had helped build, a place where strangers across the country searched for patterns no one else would admit were there. Then, in early September of that 3rd year, she received a message that pulled her breath from her lungs. A logging crew 27 miles northeast of Rock Hollow had reported seeing what looked like a child's red jacket tangled in the underbrush near a service road rarely used outside of timber transport. The message was vague and unsigned, but included a GPS coordinate and a photo, low resolution, taken on a phone, but enough to make Erin drive straight through the night. She arrived before sunrise, met by a young forest tech who'd stayed behind. He led her to a thicket just past a clearing, where the trees had been stripped bare and machinery still hummed in the distance. The jacket was there, half buried beneath pine. Needles stained with moss and exposure, but unmistakably red with a thin gray stripe across the chest. That design had haunted her for years. It matched the brand and color Mason had worn the day he disappeared. But something wasn't right. When she held it in her hands, her heart clenched. The tag was from the same company, but the size was wrong. It was a youth large. Mason had worn a small. Still, DNA swabs were taken. The sheriff's office reopened the file for processing. It took 3 weeks for the results to return. The report came back inconclusive. Partial DNA markers were found, but they didn't match Mason directly. Too degraded, too much time. The garment had been exposed to heat, moisture, and animal contamination. No hair, no blood. Just one possible fiber that loosely matched the type used in Mason's vest. It wasn't enough. But for Erin, it changed everything. The proximity of the site to Rock Hollow reignited her belief that someone had taken Mason and they hadn't gone far. She began compiling data, something she had been doing in fragments for years, but now with fresh urgency. Missing children, male, ages 6 to 14, remote areas, near water. She started with her own state, then spread outward. It wasn't hard to find cases. Boys who disappeared from campsites, boys lost during hikes, boys who, like Mason, were there 1 minute and gone the next. The most disturbing pattern wasn't the similarities in their age or gender. It was that none of them were ever found. Not the bodies, not the belongings, no bones, no trace, like something had plucked them out of time and space. One boy, 13, had disappeared from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan during a scout trip. His shoes were found by a stream, neatly placed side by side. No other sign. Another child, age 9, vanished while walking 100 feet behind his father on a family trail. His voice was heard seconds before he went silent. His backpack was discovered weeks later, zipped and clean, miles off trail. Erin began color-coding the data. Red for lake disappearances, blue for rivers, and green for forest trails near water. Her digital map looked like a scatterplot of grief, but the overlaps were unmistakable. These weren't random, at least not to her. She started corresponding with other parents. Some were open, eager to connect, others refused. One father from Oregon had lost his son in a boating trip in 2011. He responded to her email with a single line. "If you find a pattern, it won't bring him back." But Erin wasn't trying to bring Mason back anymore, not in the way she used to. Now, she was trying to understand what kind of silence could exist in so many places and leave the same wound every time. She reached out to a former FBI profiler who had done work on missing persons in wilderness zones. He told her off the record that some disappearances don't fit any known criminal or environmental profile, that some cases stick with agents not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. No trail, no prints, no remains, no answers. The jacket, now sealed in evidence storage, remained a point of debate. The sheriff's office declined to confirm whether it had been Mason's, citing lack of physical proof. But internally, they reopened searches in the 10-mile radius around the logging road. Cadaver dogs were brought in again, though none hit on anything. The terrain was harsh, uneven rock, boggy in parts, with countless deadfall areas. A place where anything could vanish beneath decades of moss and never be uncovered. Nothing else was recovered. No additional clothing, no gear, no bones. The hope that flickered when the jacket was found slowly dimmed again. Erin marked the spot on her map, wrote the date in her journal, and moved on to the next name, the next case. She no longer believed Mason's disappearance was isolated. And while she didn't have a suspect, She had a question she couldn't shake. Why were boys disappearing near water, always in remote places, and why did none of them ever leave anything behind that told their story? Lucas Mendez wasn't part of the original investigation. He didn't know the Carters, had never been to Rock Hollow Lake, and had no ties to the county. What he did have was a reason, one rooted in something that happened when he was 11. His older brother, Miguel, vanished during a fishing trip in California's Shasta Trinity Wilderness. One minute they were arguing about whose turn it was to reel in the line, and the next, Miguel had stepped off the trail and was never seen again. No one found him. No noise, no struggle. Just that hollow absence that families never fully recover from. That memory stayed with Lucas. Through adolescence, through years of therapy that never quite worked, through a military diving career that honed his skill in dark, unforgiving water. By the time he left active duty, he had already joined 3 volunteer search groups. He became the person who showed up when local efforts had failed, when grieving families were left with nothing but silence. He wasn't reckless, but he pushed deeper than most were willing to go. When Mason Carter's case found its way onto his radar, it was the detail about the missing GoPro that caught his attention. He visited Rock Hollow alone. No camera crew, no permits. Just a used Ford Explorer, a custom-built sonar array, and enough gear for 2 weeks of solo diving. He introduced himself to the sheriff's department and was politely dismissed. They told him everything that could be searched had already been searched, that the lake had been scanned thoroughly by state teams with better equipment. Lucas didn't argue. He wasn't there to win approval. He was there to look where others hadn't, or maybe where they hadn't looked long enough. He focused on the north end of the lake, near the old dock where Mason was last seen. The terrain had been mapped multiple times, but Lucas wasn't convinced it had been fully understood. Rock Hollow wasn't a flat-bottomed lake. It was a collapsed glacial bowl, scarred with vertical ridges, uneven ledges, and deep twisting fissures that dropped far beyond the reach of standard sonar sweeps. Most search teams avoided those areas because they were narrow and unstable, and visibility dropped to near zero. But that's exactly where Lucas believed something could hide. He dived every morning at dawn, alone, dragging his sonar sled behind him on a tether. By the 6th day, he had begun to map out a pocket of the lake where sediment formed strange peaks. A portion of the northern basin seemed off, like the lake floor dipped suddenly and then narrowed. On the 7th dive, he followed a ledge that curved inward, barely squeezing between rock faces that scraped his tank. The current there was subtle but unpredictable. A sudden push sent him sideways. His flipper caught on an outcrop, and he slammed against the rock wall hard enough to crack his faceplate. He surfaced fast, gasping, bleeding from a shallow cut on his lip. But he marked the coordinates. The following morning, despite the risk, he returned. What he found on that 8th dive was barely visible, a narrow slit between rocks, just wide enough to slide a hand through. Something was lodged inside. At first he thought it was a stone, but the surface was too smooth. He tugged gently. It didn't move. He adjusted his angle, kicked back against the current, and pulled again. It slid loose. When he surfaced, he sat on the edge of his boat in silence, holding a rectangular object coated in algae and grime. It was a waterproof case, scratched, sealed shut by pressure and time. He knew what it was before he opened it. Back at the dock, with a utility knife and a pair of gloves, he pried it open. Inside was a GoPro, its lens clouded, the strap still buckled to a corroded harness plate. It had been down there for years. He turned it over in his hand. The red recording light was long dead. The SD card slot was intact. Lucas didn't tell the sheriff's office immediately. He wanted to confirm what he had before handing it over. He dried the card, cleaned the contacts, and used his recovery software, tools he had used before for salvaging data from submerged memory. The file tree loaded slowly. Corruption was visible in most folders, but 2 video files showed viable metadata. The first was time-stamped just after 6:42 a.m. on the day Mason disappeared. The second was shorter, titled only with numbers, its creation date unreadable. Lucas copied both files onto a secure drive, then contacted Mason's mother. She didn't answer. He drove directly to the sheriff's department instead. When they asked what he had found, he didn't speak. He held up the GoPro and simply said, "It's his." What would eventually emerge from that tiny plastic case would shift the investigation's trajectory for the first time in years. But at that moment, all anyone could do was wait while the footage was reviewed frame by frame. Lucas stood in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes on the door, heart pounding, not with hope, but with the cold certainty that whatever was on that card would not bring peace. It would bring more questions, and it would change everything they thought they knew about what happened at Rock Hollow Lake. The recovered SD card from Mason Carter's GoPro was sent to a digital forensics lab specializing in corrupted video restoration, a facility contracted occasionally by state and federal agencies when standard recovery methods failed. The lab's first assessment wasn't promising. Years of water exposure had caused severe data degradation. Of the 2 files Lucas Mendez had recovered, one was too damaged to reconstruct. The other, labeled with a timestamp matching the morning Mason vanished, showed partial integrity, enough for a full-length preview with occasional frame loss, audio warping, and pixel distortions. It took 6 days of repair work before the lab declared it viewable. Erin Carter was notified first. She asked to be present. The sheriff's office agreed, and on a quiet Tuesday morning, she was escorted into the viewing room where 2 homicide detectives, a digital analyst, and the district's victim liaison were already seated. Erin didn't speak as the screen lit up. Her hands trembled as she braced herself against the table. She had waited almost 4 years to see what her son had seen on that lake. The footage began abruptly. The lens pointed slightly down, capturing Mason's chest, then the dock, then water rippling gently under soft sunlight. The date and timestamp rolled at the bottom left, 6:42 a.m. The boy adjusted the camera as he leaned forward, hooking a worm. His voice was faint but cheerful. He hummed something tuneless, unaware of how significant these moments would become. At one point, he turned toward Jonah, who stood on the bank skipping stones, and laughed. The laughter sounded real, pure. He said something about getting the biggest fish today. The rod jerked slightly, and Mason lunged forward. The camera tilted toward the water, catching a splash and then refocusing on the sky as he leaned back, grinning. There was no sense of danger, no sign of fear, just a child documenting the quiet moments of a peaceful morning. Roughly 16 minutes in, something changed. The audio warped slightly. Background noise faded. Mason stood still, scanning the tree line across the lake. The camera caught the trees and the edge of the water, then shifted left, tracing the dock. Nothing unusual. But Erin's breathing caught. She knew her son's posture. Something about the way his shoulders tensed suggested he was watching something not recorded in his voice or expression, but felt all the same. Mason slowly turned back to his tackle box, knelt to open it, then paused. He didn't say anything, but the frame jittered slightly as if his hand had started to tremble. The GoPro shifted downward, tilted briefly toward the far side of the dock, and then caught a reflection, something upright and still on the surface of the water. The footage glitched hard at that point. Color bled. Audio dropped completely. For 3 seconds, the screen showed frozen lines. Then it recovered. The GoPro was now recording from the ground. It had fallen, lens tilted slightly to the right, resting on the damp wooden planks. The corner of Mason's boot appeared in frame, motionless. A shadow moved across it, long, slow, and then gone. No voice, no splash, just movement. Then came the final 20 seconds. As the camera slid, likely kicked or knocked, the lens rolled slightly, capturing the edge of the dock, then the water, then the tree line. And just before the feed cut entirely, one frame, sharp, sudden, and chilling, was captured and frozen during forensic analysis. In that single frame, standing waist-deep in the water approximately 15 feet behind Mason, was a human figure. He wasn't supposed to be there. The figure's face was blurred by motion, his form partially obscured by light bouncing off the water's surface. But the shape was unmistakable. Adult, male, shirtless, lean. His arms hung limply at his sides. His head was tilted just enough to suggest he was staring forward, toward the dock. Toward Mason. Investigators paused the frame, zoomed, analyzed pixel groupings. There was no fishing pole in the man's hands, no boat nearby, and no ripples indicated he had moved through the lake recently. He was just there, still, watching, present. The problem was that every account from that day, every witness, every sonar reading, every report, confirmed that the only people on that lake were Mason, Jonah, and Ray. The figure didn't match any of them, not in build, not in placement. If someone else had been there, it would have been impossible not to notice. The shoreline was open, the water was calm, and the trail cameras captured no other visitors that morning. Yet this man, whoever he was, stood in the water, feet from the dock, unseen by anyone but the camera. When Erin saw the image, she didn't speak. She leaned forward, stared hard, then whispered a single word. I knew. Investigators froze the frame, printed it, and logged it into evidence. Facial recognition failed to identify the figure. No missing persons, no escaped felons, and no hikers reported in the area that week matched his description. The sheriff's office quietly reclassified Mason's file as suspicious. For the first time in nearly 4 years, they had something. Not an answer, but a sliver of truth buried in digital decay. Someone had been at Rock Hollow that day, and Mason saw him. The last moments of his life, unintentionally recorded, now left investigators with a single haunting question: who was the man in the water, and how had he gotten so close without anyone ever knowing he was there? The blurred figure, captured in the final frame of Mason Carter's GoPro, was all investigators had to work with, but even that single image became a catalyst. The sheriff's department, now working in coordination with a small digital forensics firm out of Duluth, began a slow and meticulous enhancement process. Bit by bit, pixel clusters were interpolated, adjusted, and sharpened. There was no magic involved, just the brutal patience of digital reconstruction. What emerged after 2 weeks was clearer than anyone had expected. The man in the lake appeared to be in his late 40s to early 50s, tall, narrow-shouldered, and angularly built. His beard was long, uneven, and streaked with gray. His expression, though smeared slightly by motion blur, had an unsettling stillness to it. He wore a torn jacket, once green, possibly military surplus, with the left sleeve missing entirely. Underneath, his ribs were visible through the damp fabric. His eyes, caught by sheer chance in the moment the frame froze, were open, wide, focused. The image was cross-checked through every available law enforcement database, local, state, and federal. It was run through missing persons reports, hospital psychiatric discharges, and even a handful of international alerts from neighboring Canadian provinces. Nothing came back. Not a single facial match. It was as if the man didn't exist. And yet there he was, in the water behind Mason, just seconds before the camera went dead. Investigators broadened their scope. They looked beyond identification. They searched for similarities, visual markers, clothing types, and recurring behavior patterns in unsolved regional cases. That's when the cousin, Jonah, who had been largely silent for years, was quietly re-interviewed by the department's new lead detective. The boy, now nearly 17, had grown into himself, still reserved but articulate. He was shown the enhanced image, and immediately his body language changed. He didn't say the man's name because he didn't know it, but he said without hesitation, "That's him. That's the man I saw." He explained that months before Mason disappeared, while hiking with his father near the east ridge above Rock Hollow, he had seen someone in the trees, watching them from the opposite slope. A man in a tattered green coat, silent, not moving. When Jonah pointed it out to Ray, his father hadn't seen anyone. They'd laughed it off, but Jonah remembered how still the man was, how his eyes hadn't blinked. Now, years later, he realized he'd seen the same face that appeared behind Mason on the video. That admission was enough to warrant a second search of the lake perimeter. This time, teams focused not on the water, but on the higher elevations, wooded trails, game paths, and old deer blinds that had long since rotted away. On the fourth day of the new sweep, a volunteer stumbled upon a small outcropping of stone hidden behind collapsed brush. It wasn't much, just a dry recess between rocks. But inside was a partially decomposed canvas backpack, weathered, torn, covered in mildew. Inside were rusted utensils, a rotting wool blanket, and wrapped in old plastic, a water-damaged Polaroid photo. The image showed two children, both boys, both shirtless, standing in front of a tent. The photo had faded badly, but one boy had red hair and the other wore a Detroit Tigers cap. The scene looked like a campsite, possibly in summer. The timestamp on the back had washed away, but the forensic team recovered enough detail to identify the type of film stock, last manufactured in the late 1990s. The photo was circulated through missing children's databases, and within 72 hours, a match was found. The boys were twins. Danny and Marcus Tolland, reported missing from a campground in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in July of 1998. They'd been camping with their stepfather, who had gone fishing early one morning and returned to find the tent unzipped and the boys gone. Their bodies were never found. Their case had remained unsolved for over 2 decades. Now, suddenly, their image appeared in a makeshift shelter in the woods above a Minnesota lake, inside a bag surrounded by objects that hadn't seen sunlight in years. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough for a connection. More files were pulled, more patterns reviewed, and quietly, a list of disappearances, previously thought unconnected, started to align. Boys between the ages of 8 and 14, always in remote areas, always near water, always no trace left behind. There were 5 in total, including Mason, 5 cold cases now carrying the same shadow, and at the center of them all, a man with no name, no records, and no known origin. For the Carter family, this discovery opened old wounds, but it also brought a shift. Erin was contacted directly. She was shown the photo of the 2 boys, then the photo of the man behind Mason. She didn't cry. She didn't speak much. She asked only one question: why didn't they find him sooner? No one had an answer. The sheriff's office, now under new leadership, issued a public statement acknowledging the discovery of compelling evidence linking Mason Carter's disappearance to prior unsolved cases. For the first time in years, the word serial was used in an official capacity, though no charges had been filed and no body had been recovered. The man in the photo remained nameless. He had never been seen at a grocery store, never used a credit card, and never left behind a print or DNA. But now, investigators had reason to believe he had moved through these woods for years, possibly decades, taking children, leaving no trace, until one boy, wearing a camera, accidentally caught him in a single silent frame. The storm arrived without warning on a late October evening, a violent force that ripped through the Rock Hollow region. With relentless fury, winds screamed through the ancient pines, bending trunks like twigs and tearing leaves from branches in wild cascades. Rain battered the surface of the lake, transforming its once glassy calm into roiling waves that crashed against the shoreline. For hours, the tempest held the forest in its grip, a tumultuous roar that drowned out all other sounds. When morning came, the sky had cleared to an eerie stillness, the sun's pale light struggling through a thick layer of mist clinging to the ground. The storm had left its mark. Trees uprooted, debris scattered, and in one particular corner of the far side of the lake, a secret long buried had been unearthed. At the edge of a dense thicket, an enormous oak lay fallen, its massive roots torn violently from the earth. Beneath its sprawling limbs, partially hidden by moss and the forest's slow reclamation, the weathered outline of an old shack was exposed for the first time in decades. The structure was small, no more than a modest cabin or hunting blind, its wooden frame bowed under the weight of time and neglect. The roof sagged in places, with shingles missing or cracked, while faded paint peeled from the walls, mottled with lichen and streaks of water damage. Windows were shattered or boarded, some glass shards glinting dimly beneath the scattered leaves. The scene had a stillness that belied the horrors it would soon reveal. Volunteers, local deputies, and members of a cold case task force converged on the site in the days that followed. Their footsteps were slow and measured, voices hushed as they stepped carefully over broken floorboards and crushed brush. Inside the shack, the air hung heavy with dust, dampness, and the unmistakable scent of rot. Old cans, rusted but recognizable as preserved beans, soup, and fruit, lined makeshift shelves, remnants of a survivalist existence. On the floor, scattered among the debris, were small personal artifacts belonging unmistakably to children: a cracked plastic toy truck with chipped paint, a ragged stuffed doll missing one glassy eye, and a pair of scuffed sneakers with frayed laces and worn soles. Torn sleeping bags, shredded and stained, lay haphazardly in a corner, their synthetic fibers brittle and weathered. Along one wall, investigators discovered a series of deep, deliberate scratches etched into the wood. The marks formed vertical rows, tallies measuring growth, the passage of days or months. Some tallies were crossed out, others layered over with fresh scratches. Forensic specialists concluded that the marks were likely made by children confined in this space, who recorded their height or time spent in captivity, a haunting testament to their presence. The realization sent a chill through the team. This place was more than a shelter. It was a prison. The darkest secrets of the shack lay hidden beneath the floorboards. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect the faintest traces of human remains, were brought in, their noses twitching as they sniffed the cold earth beneath the rotting planks. The dogs reacted strongly in one particular corner of the crawl space, their bodies stiffening and alerting handlers with urgent signals. Excavators and forensic anthropologists carefully began to dig, unearthing fragments of human bone buried just beneath the surface. The bones were small and fragile, clearly from a juvenile, scattered but unmistakably human. The discovery shattered any lingering hope that the shack was empty, revealing the grim truth that a child had once died or been killed here. Samples of the bone fragments were quickly sent to a specialized lab for DNA extraction and analysis. Scientists worked meticulously to isolate genetic material despite decades of exposure to moisture and decay. The results came back with a devastating clarity. The DNA matched one of the two boys who had vanished from a Michigan campground in 1998, the same twins whose faded Polaroid had been found years earlier, tucked inside a rotted backpack not far from this very shack. Danny and Marcus Tolland, missing for over 20 years, had been here, and the shack was their final grim landmark. The discovery linked the Rock Hollow site to a pattern of disappearances previously considered unrelated. 5 boys between the ages of 8 and 14 were now connected through evidence to this place, each missing from remote lakes or wooded areas scattered across the upper Midwest. In every case, no full remains were found. Only scattered fragments or personal effects were discovered years later in unlikely locations. The shack stood as a silent witness to this trail of horror, evidence that someone had been holding these children captive, concealed in the wilderness for years, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. For the Carter family, the revelation was a cruel mixture of closure and agony. Erin was shown the photos of the shack, the tallies, and the recovered fragments. She absorbed the facts with stoic determination, fighting back tears as she grappled with the knowledge that Mason was almost certainly part of a larger nightmare, yet remained missing. No remains matching Mason's DNA were found, and no belongings directly connected to him emerged from the site. The shack was preserved as a crime scene, sealed off and cataloged meticulously. Experts sifted through every splinter and scrap, hoping for any clue, any fragment that might lead to Mason. But the silence persisted. The community surrounding Rock Hollow was shaken anew. Rumors spread of hidden horrors lurking beneath the placid surface of the lake and the dense pines. Investigators reopened cold case files, revisited old witness statements, and sought patterns where none had been seen before. The shack was a grim symbol of the darkness concealed within the forest, a place where children had been trapped and lost, and where answers came at a terrifying cost. As months passed, Mason's fate remained the unanswered question. The shack provided proof of captivity, of suffering, but no sign of his final moments. Aaron's hope flickered like a candle in the wind, kept alive by the possibility that somewhere, somehow, Mason's story was not yet over. The shack beneath the pines had opened a door, one that could not be closed again, and it beckoned investigators deeper into a mystery that stretched far beyond Rock Hollow's quiet waters. Divers returned to the narrow crevice beneath the dock at Rock Hollow Lake with a grim determination that had long been absent from the investigation. Years of shifting sediment, decay, and time had altered the underwater landscape, but the fissure, once submerged and hidden, was now partially exposed due to changing water levels and natural erosion. The team approached the site with cautious precision, knowing that this small gap in the lakebed might hold the final heartbreaking answers they had been searching for all these years. The water was cold and murky, visibility limited to a few feet even with powerful underwater lights. Slowly, carefully, the divers maneuvered through the constricted space, muscles straining against the pressure and the tightness of the opening. The silence underwater was oppressive, punctuated only by the muffled sound of their breathing and the soft scrape of their equipment against stone. Their search revealed what no one wanted to find: skeletal remains, fragile and bleached, entwined in a rusted chain that had once bound a child's ankle. The bones lay nestled among decaying leaves and sediment, stubbornly clinging to fragments of clothing. The fabric, faded and tattered, matched the jacket Mason Carter had worn the day he vanished. Bits of the waterproof vest and the edges of a boot were still discernible, confirming the identity that had haunted the community for nearly 5 years. The rusted chain told a harrowing story. Mason hadn't drowned by accident. He had been held captive, bound, and trapped beneath the icy water. The shack beneath the pines, the strange tally marks, and the missing boys in the surrounding forests now coalesced into a dark narrative of abduction and imprisonment. Amidst the bones and the cold silence, divers found something even more unsettling: a second waterlogged camera, wedged into the crevice beside the remains. Its casing was swollen and algae-encrusted, the result of years submerged and forgotten. The camera was carefully extracted and sent to a forensic lab equipped to handle such delicate recoveries. The lab worked for weeks to restore the damaged memory card, carefully extracting corrupted data and piecing together fragments of footage. Most files were unreadable, swallowed by water and time. But one clip survived: a short, haunting sequence that would unravel the final moments of Mason's life. The recovered footage was shaky and fragmented, but undeniably captured through Mason's own eyes. The camera wavered, a small hand trembling as it reached for something or someone off-screen. Suddenly, the camera jerked sharply, spinning to reveal a face frozen in stark terror. Mason's own, wide-eyed and pale, lips parted in a silent scream. Behind him, the blurred outline of a man loomed, tall, gaunt, with a ragged beard and a torn jacket, the very figure that had haunted previous footage. The man's eyes were dark, vacant, and fixed unblinkingly on Mason. The clip ended abruptly as the camera slipped beneath the water, the image dissolving into blackness. This terrifying glimpse into the final moments shattered years of uncertainty and disbelief. Investigators pored over the footage frame by frame, piecing together the horror Mason had endured. The man in the water, who had been invisible to everyone else, had been watching them for hours, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for his moment. Law enforcement officials deepened their inquiry, uncovering the man's identity as a mentally ill hermit who had escaped from a correctional facility more than a decade prior. Known for his violent tendencies and isolationist lifestyle, he had disappeared into the wilderness around Rock Hollow, living off the grid and evading capture. The community had whispered about his presence for years, but without proof, the warnings had gone unheeded. For Mason's mother, Erin, the revelation was a bittersweet blow. After years of searching and waiting, the truth had emerged from the depths, dark, brutal, and undeniable. Though the knowledge of her son's fate crushed her heart, it also offered a form of closure she had long been denied. Mason had not simply vanished. He had been taken, trapped, and killed in a place no one dared imagine. Yet now she could bring him home, laying him to rest with the dignity and love every mother wishes for her child. The shack beneath the pines, the tally marks on the wall, the scattered bones, all pointed to a nightmare hidden within the peaceful wilderness, a reminder of the darkness lurking beneath the surface of serene lakes and quiet forests. As Erin prepared for a private memorial by the lake, she stood with a heavy but resolute heart. Mason's story, once a mystery, was finally told. The community, forever changed, mourned the boy who had been lost but never forgotten. And while the lake would never again hold the same innocence, Mason was finally home.